fan of horror games. I've played more horror games than I can count, and I've never enjoyed a horror game more than I've enjoyed Cry of Fear. But first, what is fear? According to my extensive Google search, I found out that the definition of fear is an unpleasant emotion caused by risk of pain, danger, or harm. So, how does this apply to horror games? Well, fear does not need a physical form of danger to still happen. The brain can simulate pain based off of a stimulant, such as previous experiences. The brain also knows what to correlate with fear and can make you scared if you get into a situation which might not even cause pain. For example, playing a horror game. There isn't an actual monster chasing you, but it stimulates the feeling, which in turn makes you scared and fearful of any threat. The game is set in a desolate Sweden, where our protagonist, Simon Henriksson, tries to help a man he sees crawling in the street, but he ends up being hit by a car. He wakes up in a dark alleyway with a Sony Ericsson and a pocket knife. The inventory in this game is extremely limited, only allocating 6 slots to items and allowing you to hotkey 3 out of those 6 items. As Simon walks around the dark Swedish streets, he's greeted by absolutely nothing, only seeing glimpses of what seems to be civilization, as if they're stalking him and don't want Simon to catch up. Simon ends up reaching a door, which has a padlock on it, where the code is found on a computer located in a cafe. This is my main criticism with the game. The backtracking is absolutely terrible, especially in the mid-game, where the game turns into like a linear open world styled game. So, Simon unlocks the padlock. He enters a hallway and finds an old tape recorder on the floor. This is our first save point and the symbol for save points throughout the whole game. After a couple of knife fights, like a true Swede, Simon ends up having to do parkour to get into the apartments. Parkour is kind of also awful. It's janky, and especially with the dodge mechanic, if you try and tap the keys to get it pixel perfect, you ended up just dodging off the scaffolding. Although, the next part of the game really makes it worth it. Entering the apartment instantly tensed me up on my first couple of playthroughs. The visuals in this part of the game are terrifying. The quiet ambience of the corridors, the crying you hear coming from specific rooms, and the Half-Life 2 flashlight lighting up about 3 centimeters in front of you really makes the experience horrifying. On top of this, the graphics really do the game justice. And I mean, they really do it justice. The fact that the graphics are limited, yet Rumpel was able to make the game look good, is mind-blowing. The apartment sequence makes the game feel claustrophobic, as most of the attacks are done in smaller spaces with no escape, forcing Simon into combat. Luckily, in the apartments, Simon finds himself a firearm, a basic pistol, which will be one of the better weapons throughout the game. Another item I need to talk about are healing items. The healing items are morphine injections. This is because morphine is a strong painkiller, which is a big hint to the ending of the game. When using the healing items, you can see some scars from self-harming, which becomes relevant as well. Simon needs to find someone who's been messaging him on the 4th floor of the apartment, and after spending a long time finding a way up and into the 4th floor, backtracking the whole complex looking for keys, it turns out the man committed suicide, blood drenching the bath as Simon looks at him, staggered by the sight. This part of the game marks as a turning point. As Simon leaves the room, he is forced to make his way down the hall and into the basement. While searching for the basement key, he sees that the hallways have changed, being barricaded, stopping him from accessing certain parts of the floor, and making Simon find new ways into the block's area. After entering the basement, Simon enters an empty room with a bloody chair, a noose, and a desk with a videotape on it.
That is your next task. Find something that will allow him to play videotapes. Simon reaches the bottom floor of the building, only to find himself in a sick and bloody version of the apartments. Descending many flights of stairs and reaching a door, Simon fights the first boss in the game, the Sawyer, who can kill Simon instantly if he manages to hit him with the chainsaw. The only way to do damage to him is through the eye on his back. Simon staggers him by shooting him in the head, which causes him to fall to his knee and allows Simon to shoot the eye, chipping away at his health. Once the enemy has received enough damage, Sawyer will fall to his knees in pain before beheading himself with a chainsaw, leaving Simon shocked and passed out, finishing the chapter. Then we begin chapter 2. Simon wakes up, startled by the presence of a doctor. The doctor comforts Simon, telling him he should, referring to the enemies. The doctor then tells Simon and runs through a door, locking it behind him. Confused, Simon heads out into the city to get home to his mother. After descending a broken ladder, Simon finds himself in an area with a cave. In one of the rooms, Simon finds a note saying that the code to a keypad is 279 with the final number scribbled out. Simon has to brute force the code. Behind the door, Simon finds a shotgun and a lighter. The lighter is used to burn a trail of oil found in the same room the door code was found. After a couple of enemies, Simon ends up finding the doctor beheading someone for not telling him where a key is. Simon interrupts the doctor, causing the doctor to flee the room. After the doctor leaves, Simon is greeted by a gruesome, disfigured creature called Mace. Mace shows Simon the key before swallowing it, causing the second boss fight of the game. Simon must use electricity to kill the monster and must go on a journey to find a saw and cut the monster open to obtain the key. Powering on, Simon enters a bloody hallway with writing on the wall saying things like asking if he likes it. Then he enters another hallway with a metal grating on the floor. Suddenly, hands shoot up and attack Simon, causing him to sprint through a maze to reach the end of the hall. After escaping, Simon gets flashbacks of police cars and ambulances detailing what happened after he got hit. Simon's confused and doesn't know if it's just a flashback or if he's losing his sanity. Simon proceeds into another area of the city. He gets a text message from his mother, who tells him to get home quickly as she's worried about him. As he makes his way back, he sees a grotesque creature blocking the path, forcing him to find a different route. He crawls through vents and in different industrial areas. While on his way, he's ambushed by the biggest threat of the game, the Saw Runner. Simon escapes the creature after running through a maze of alleyways and jumping into a lower area of the city. He proceeds to a park where he receives a phone call. Simon answers, but the signal makes the call almost inaudible, only being able to hear that they were on the roof. Simon proceeds onto the roof, where he finds his only friend and love interest, Sophie. Simon and Sophie have a conversation, where Sophie thanks Simon for making her life a bit more bearable, as she was bullied and he was the only person who was kind to her. Simon then reveals that he loved her, but never had the courage to tell her. Sophie tells Simon that she likes him too, but only as a friend and nothing further. Simon asks if she was the one who called him, and Sophie says that she called him to get away from it all. Simon, confused, asks what she meant before Sophie jumps off the edge of the roof, killing herself. As Simon goes to look down to see where her carcass is laying, a new creature appears, the carcass. Simon blames the creature as the cause of Sophie's suicide. Then there is an option. Simon can either fight the boss or flee the scene. This affects the ending of the game. After whatever option you pick, Simon goes down to where Sophie's body is and gets another flashback where Simon confesses his feelings. Sophie then tells Simon to let her go, where the flashback ends, and so does the chapter. Simon grabs a keycard from off of Sophie's body and proceeds on his journey. He reaches a subway station. Unfortunately, the door is locked and requires a fuse to open. Simon travels to Harbour College, where he finds the fuse while being ambushed by an enemy called the Faceless. Simon manages to escape the ambush and escapes the college with the fuse, returning to the subway station and using his fuse to enter. He realizes that the door is blocked by the same monster that blocked his path earlier on, and proceeds to use one of the trains to crush it. This clears the path and allows Simon to proceed. After this, Simon's phone ends up dying, and the only available light sources are some flares scattered around. While trying to find his way out of the subway, Simon hears something following him, breathing heavily as he gets closer and closer. Simon gets ambushed by some suicidal who have been armed with a knife. Simon defeats these enemies and continues his way, only to be almost killed by a train that suddenly appears. Simon exits the tunnel and reaches another station, only to be greeted by the sounds of gunfire. He notices that the doctor is in the station, and that he has just killed someone. Simon follows him and finds out the doctor locked the door behind him. Simon finds a new phone battery for his phone and a key. Simon realizes he needs to find 2 fuses for the door to open, so he makes his way to the first fuse and returns to the apartment, searching for another. In the apartments, he encounters another enemy type called the Strangers. After reaching a roped-off apartment, Simon finds a ladder that goes down into the sewers. Simon lowers himself down and enters another nightmare. This time, it is a large corridor in complete darkness. Simon hears the doctor talking about one of his patients, and hears that the patient always goes back to the same place, just watching it like it was yesterday. After that, Simon enters a room with a massive head, thrashing around wildly, with 2 cages at each side releasing Faceless. After Simon fights the Faceless, a 3rd cage opens, revealing a door. Simon opens it, only to find that behind the door is another saw runner. The floor collapses, and Simon runs towards the only light he can see, and enters a completely white room. Simon opens a door in front of him, which returns him to the roped-off apartment, where he can obtain the 2nd fuse. After opening the door with the fuses, Simon reaches a train station that has a signal malfunction and requires 2 fuses to work. Simon finds a sledgehammer and breaks a brick wall to access the door, only to find himself in another nightmare. This time, it is pitch black, with several platforms and cages hanging from nothing. Inside of the cages are deformed humans self-harming. Simon crosses the platform and reaches a room with 4 doors and a note that shows him the correct door to enter. Simon enters the doors in the correct order, no shit man, and reaches a bloody maze where he is chased by creatures known as the Hangmen. He manages to find the exit, but before he reaches the door, he sees another flashback. This time, it depicts the doctor talking to police about Simon. The doctor states that Simon was lucky to retain his upper body motion, but from the waist down, there's no nervous response at all. He also states that Simon has documented mental health issues prior to the accident. Simon collapses, losing temporary usage of his legs. He crawls towards the door and exits the maze. Simon retrieves the fuses and manages to get the train working again. He enters the train and begins to think about what has happened so far. He wonders if what's going on is real or just a hallucination. Just to get interrupted by a sound coming from the back of the train. He goes over and checks out what's going on, just to realize the train is infested with creatures. The train hits a damaged part of the track. With the train about to fall, Simon manages to jump out of the train before it falls off the edge, leaving Simon without his bag and any items in his pockets. After escaping the train, Simon realizes that he's in a pitch-black forest. But since there is nothing he can do, he continues on his journey. He encounters enemies known as the Crazy Runners, who are littered around the forest. Simon manages to find a way out of the forest and reaches a mental institution, where he regains contact with the doctor and sees him entering. He turns on the power supply and reaches the doctor. The doctor asks Simon to hand over his gun, and he will open the door for him. Simon agrees to find a gun if the doctor keeps his promises. Simon can choose between giving the doctor the gun or not. This decision also affects the ending. After this, the doctor shoots Simon in the shoulder and leaves with a permanent chunk of health gone, which is dependent on your choice. Simon goes to the attic after fighting his way through enemies known as psychos and finds the doctor. The two of them engage in gunfight, with Simon killing the doctor. Simon has another flashback of the doctor talking to Simon, who's in a wheelchair because of the accident. The doctor tells Simon that the medication will not help by itself and recommends that Simon tries cognitive therapy and asks Simon to write about his feelings in his book. After the flashback ends, Simon kills the doctor by stomping on his head. Simon grabs a key dropped by the doctor and proceeds on his way. Simon comes across a lake and crosses it with a boat. This part of the game is beautiful. He reaches an abandoned house where the stairs collapse and causes Simon to get ambushed by a bunch of crazy runners. Simon enters a sewer and manages to get to Kirkville, his hometown. There are monsters scattered everywhere. Simon reaches his home and wonders if his mother is still there.
He enters his house just to realise his mother isn't there. He then enters his room and finds a book, and then another flashback happens. Simon realises that the events of the game have all been a projection of Simon's mind, and that the choices in the game decides his fate.
If the carcass was killed and Simon gave the doctor the gun, Simon finishes his book and prepares to commit suicide. But he gets interrupted by his book counterpart, who opens his door and disappears. At this point, the player realizes that the events in Cry of Fear are nothing more than a metaphor of Simon's journal. The Simon controlled throughout the game is a mental projection of the real Simon, and different parts of the game represent his trauma and psychosis. The real Simon, paralyzed and in a wheelchair, follows Book Simon through another nightmare. This time, there are giant hands with self-harm scars, representing Simon's self-harm after the accident. There are also giant eyes that seize. Book Simon will appear in a long, dark hallway, ready to kill the real Simon, which represents Simon's suicide. Simon luckily manages to kill his book counterpart, ending the nightmare sequence and triggering the fourth ending. It is revealed that Simon didn't kill himself, but rather he killed two police officers who entered his apartment, trying to stop him. Doctors testify that Simon was having a psychotic episode, and he gets inferred into a mental hospital for what is seemingly the rest of his life. Receiving treatment from Dr. Purnell and gets regularly visited by Sophie, he finally comes to peace with his mental health issues, finishes the book, saying that it has changed his life. If you didn't kill Carcass or give the gun to the doctor, Simon will kill himself after writing the book with a stellar monologue.
Dear Diary, this is it. I have ended my miserable life. They showed me that there was no one and nothing worth living for. The pills showed me the truth today. They always did. They opened my eyes. They gave me wisdom, and I acted upon it. So, I had to kill Sophie and my doctor. To whoever is reading this, I hope my dead body will haunt you forever. Have fun scraping my brains off the wall. Fuck you!
Now, personally, I think the game is captivating and scary in a way that creates fear and tension while making you want to keep playing. There are areas in the game that are just a big pain in the ass, like the Gustav Dahl's puzzle park, which took me 45 minutes to complete, by the way. The game is scary to me because it's close to home. Not as in I live in Sweden. The mental health shit, yeah. The game doesn't glorify depression or any of the suicidal themes. The game really shows how harrowing major depressive disorder can be to the 280 million people who suffer from it. Taking the character of Dr. Purnell and villainizing him when he is just a doctor trying to help Simon overcome his depression really represents how people with certain disorders may villainize the people who want to help them. The choice where you either give the doctor the gun or not represents whether you as the player or Simon trusts the doctor, with both choices ending up in the same outcome. If you choose to trust him, you lose more health than if you choose not to trust him. I think this is a perfect representation of how trusting the doctor will do more damage in the short term, but has a larger payoff. The gas mask that the doctor wears may represent the fact that Simon finds the doctor mysterious. The cutscenes where Purnell kills people could represent how Simon feels like the doctor will do damage to him, like he did to the others. The game is able to keep the player feeling lonely. While having the streets packed with enemies, because there aren't any acquaintances, Simon has no friends. And the one friend he has feelings for and won't let her go. Simon feels unlovable and unable to make friends due to his disability. The game does lack in certain areas, such as the park puzzle, but overall, I feel like this game is personally one of my favorite games of all time and will probably stay as one of my favorite games for the rest of my life.
I love Dying Light.
So I've left it until the end of the game to elaborate on the enemies. So the basic enemies are the slowers, the babies, the psycho, the children, and the citalopram. But there are too many to go in depth with. So the main enemies are the slowers, who kind of walk around with a limp, but can also turn into a rapid dash. They swing their weapon in all different kinds of directions and are mainly encountered in the earlier stages of the game. The baby is found in the apartments. The baby sprints up to you and stabs you, sacrificing itself in the attempt to get an attack on you. I think that the baby represents the fact that Simon views himself as an infant due to his disability. Simon says,
My friends looked right past me. My family abandoned me. Nobody wants a cripple, especially one that would need your help. Fucking worthless.
This could be a reference to Simon's mother abandoning him after the accident, leaving him to deal with it on his own. The citalopram does the same as the slower, but when you get their health to a certain point, rather than letting you kill them, they kill themselves. A lot of the other enemies are the same as the slowers, they just vary in designs, attacks, and speeds. It's a Half-Life retexture, like what you want. Like what you expect. The carcass could represent Simon's grief towards Sophie, It's also possible that the monster represents Simon's inner feelings towards himself after the accident. Simon mentions that he feels like he's a piece of meat sitting in a chair, which could tie to this boss fight as the enemy does not have any arms or legs. Overall, this game is like mental. The fact that the game takes place inside of Simon's head is such a good plot twist, and it isn't really predictable either. The representation of mental health is nothing we've had before in any form of media, really. The subtle hint dropping might not even be noticed during the first playthrough, like the moving piece of flesh on a surgical table, or the self-harm scars when Simon pulls back his hoodie sleeve. This is the reason why I'm so in love with the game. What does the community think about it?
So I sent a questionnaire out to Reddit and Discord just to gather the community's opinion on the game. I asked questions about character designs, their favourite parts of the game, and a whole bunch of others to gather a decent amount of information. I managed to figure out how far the game has spread, getting responses from all over the world. From my questionnaire, I figured out that around half the community is between the ages of 16 to 20, but found out about the game when they were around the age of 15. When asked about why the game was so appealing to them, people responded with the fact that the atmosphere is amazing, with the representation of the depression being a really popular answer. When asked what aspects about the game scares you the most, one of the responses that stood out to me was the realism. There is no bad guy. It's all in your head, or rather, Simon's head. This answer was interesting because it's true. The fact that the game is able to convey depression without making it feel senseless is amazing. Asking people about their critiques of the games ended up getting the same criticisms that I've had, mainly the backtracking and the parkour. Someone commented on the graphics of the game, which is fair if you don't enjoy PS1 styled graphics, but I think it just really adds to the experience. People brought up the jump scares, but we don't talk about those responses. Most people gave different favourite parts of the game, but mainly the soundtrack, then the story. The soundtrack really adds to the game and makes the experience 10 times scarier than if it didn't have the musical ability that Andreas had put in it. The story of the game is fantastic and makes for a really good plot twist on your first playthrough. Collect my pages!